Hi, I'm Jonathan Geyer, Managing Editor of the American Prospect. Today, we are going to have a conversation launching the cover stories from our new issue. We're featuring Kalena Thomhave, who's a former writing fellow, a writer based in Michigan, and she's written in our new issue about the child tax credit and what can be done on that. We have Bryce Covert, who's contributed to us regularly. She also writes for The Nation and the New York Times. She's written a profile of Rosa DeLauro in this issue, a congresswoman who's been on the forefront of a lot of cash assistance and family issues. And then we have Alexander Sammon, staff writer, who unpacks UBI, Universal Basic Income, in a story called Cash is King. That's a really lively tour of what universal income would look like. So I was kind of singing in my head Patti Smith's song Free Money before this as I was rereading your stories and thinking about like what free money would mean for Americans coming out of a pandemic recession, coming out of a lot of economic change in the past year. So maybe we'll start with Alex, and just to give us a sense of because Andrew Yang has been, so buzzy and has made universal basic income, this cash assistance program, such a big deal over the presidential cycle and now in the mayoral race in New York. Can you break it down for us, Alex? What's the politics of UBI and what's the policy behind it?
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much for bringing us in, Jonathan. Yeah, UBI is interesting. It's kind of rare that you see like just a policy proposal met with such animation and excitement. And for Andrew Yang, basically no credentials other than having embraced this policy on TV. Like that's basically the basis of his entire presidential run and his mayoral run in New York City, which obviously we don't know how that will pan out. That is late June election, but obviously very competitive in that race as well. And so it's in a weird way has become like a political kingmaker in some sense for certain politicians. And Yang is probably the embodiment of this. That the idea of giving people money, very compelling slogan, and obviously has a lot of supporters in various places in American politics and voters and advocates. And I think that Yang is obviously not necessarily seen as a very serious candidate. Oftentimes, he says things that are pretty patently unserious, and it's easy to dismiss some of the stuff out of hand. But obviously, UBI is really not one of them, and it's something that has really made itself a fundamental part of the political discussion, and is become common sense for Democrats all of a sudden. We look at the Georgia runoffs in the Senate, and it was those stimulus checks were largely considered to be the reason Democrats won those races that they really had no business winning. So it's at this moment is seen as kind of like this political panacea for Democrats in a lot of ways, where they've had a really hard time with messaging, have a total aversion to new spending programs. Oftentimes you rarely see them charging headlong into new proposals that involve more cash distribution, more public spending. And here we have this thing that's, it's a political winner. It's a popular proposal, and it's been a successful plank for Andrew Yang and others, and it's very much a big part of our conversation now.
Yeah, but so one theme that came out of your story, Alex, and it's something I think Bryce has written about as well and elsewhere, is that UBI done wrong can be a real problem, or that UBI maybe represents, at its best, it represents cash for people who really need it. At its worst, it's like a replacement for actual social programs that people need, and it costs a ton of money. I mean, where do you come out on that, Bryce? Given you've looked into the history of it and how it works in practice.
Yeah, I think you've described really well what I think kind of the two camps on UBI are. I think when you say UBI, it sounds like there's a lot of political agreement because you have, like Alex was saying, you have Democrats, you have libertarians. Richard Nixon famously nearly enacted a form of it. But that sort of papers over a real important division between a lot of people who are for it. On the one hand, there are those who see it as supplemental. What we currently have is a crisis of poverty in this country. There's increasing evidence that giving people money, particularly poor people, helps them, alleviates their poverty, doesn't really have a lot of negative impacts, and would be a good thing to add on top of what we already do. Then there's the other camp that sees this as, like you said, something to take the place of what we do, what the government gives people, large bureaucracies like healthcare. Some people, libertarians who want UBI, want to wipe all of that out. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, just get rid of all of it, give people a check, let them do it on their own. And that is a starkly different proposal. Yes, both camps might agree on things like wanting to cut down on the red tape you have to get through to get government benefits, the idea that people deserve the dignity of deciding, what are my needs? How do I want to spend this money? I know what I want best. All of which is good, except that it's a $1,000 a month check is just not going to do the same thing as the anti-poverty safety net we have, as threadbare as it is, the way it currently operates.
And then I want to bring you in, Kalena. I mean, you're writing about the child tax credit in our issue, and it seems like to cover a lot of the same bases, as it's giving people money who need it, who are, part of the spectrum that, is incredibly poor. Can you tell us about, how you told this story in our issue?
Yeah, sure. And I guess to connect a little bit to what Bryce and Alex were just talking about, I mean, the child tax credit is a cash payment. It's a cash transfer. It's really similar to other basic income proposals in that it's essentially a child allowance like we see in other countries. At the same time, it's not UBI, like Bryce was just talking about. It's not universal. It's just for families with kids, and it's not basic. It's not going to meet your basic needs. $3,000 is not enough for a year. But at the same time, it is incredible. It is an incredible policy that I would not have expected, just 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago. But at the same time, it is also business as usual, I think, in the US, in that we have this really incredible payment, but it's still a tax credit. It's still run through the IRS. We're still going to see so many barriers put up to the poorest people, to actually receive it. And so, it's still like just for families with children, being that children are a really sympathetic population. So I see us like really making huge strides to tackle child poverty, but at the same time, we're still in the US, we're still in the United States, and this is the child allowance that we created here.
Well, and it's temporary too, right? I mean, one of the things that's interesting is hearing the Biden administration get so excited about ending so much of child poverty, but I guess you can't end something temporarily.
Yeah,
how do you feel about that?
That's really crucial. So right now, it's only for 1 year, and it will cut child poverty in half for 1 year. And that's, of course, if it's not made permanent. And I'm still hopeful that it could be made permanent. The Biden administration wants to extend it until 2025. But yeah, at this point, it's only for 1 year. And so possibly after that 1 year, we will redouble child poverty.
Now, I guess I want to get also into a little bit of the recent history of how UBI and cash assistance programs have gotten so popular. Alex in the issue spoke with Michael Tubbs, who was the mayor of Stockton, California. Can you tell us about that, Alex? Kind of where these policy ideas kind of, came into action and got quite popular?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Yeah. So Michael Tubbs was mayor of Stockton. Obviously, Stockton being a Northern California town that's basically been on hard times more or less since the gold rush. I mean, not one of the affluent, booming metropolitan areas of California. And his tenure is very interesting there. He enacted the first basic income proposal in a city. It was just a pilot. It was funded privately. But it was, the sort of program where they gave $500 a month and then had people, report as to how that money affected their lives. And the returns on that program were extremely positive. I mean, across the board in terms of how people were living. That $500 was very important. There was almost no drawback. I mean, it was a very successful program, but inside of that program, you can see kind of the internal contradictions and challenges with basic income, where the people who were the biggest backers of this program and who provided the financial support for it were, many of them were Silicon Valley, CEOs, tech executives, billionaires, libertarian types. So you have people like Jack Dorsey at Twitter, who's a big sponsor of this program. You have Evan Spiegel, who's the CEO of Snapchat, was a supporter of a different kind of social service program that Mayor Tubbs rolled out during that time. Chris Hughes, former Facebook co-founder, I guess, put some money into this. So you kind of have this really interesting internal dynamic where you have, UBI is this great welfare program that has, turned in really effective policy results, but at the same time, you also see where it's kind of politically unsettled. And Tubbs himself is a Stanford graduate as well, so has this proximity to Silicon Valley. And interestingly, at the end of that program, the program seems to be quite successful, but ends up being not that politically useful for Tubbs himself, who he ends up losing re-election. And obviously, that's something we can go into further. I don't want to take us too far down this one particular case study, but it is kind of all the good and the bad you can say about UBI are kind of bound up in this one example. Going forward, there are a lot of mayors and a lot of cities who are have basically taken up the mantle and are carrying the torch here, but it's not the sort of open and shut case that it seems to be, I think, on the surface, perhaps.
And I mean, Bryce, if that's an example of Michael Tubbs as like a mayor doing this, can you give us some examples of how, at the federal level, how Congress people are tackling issues and thinking about free money or tax credits or policies that will, really make a difference for the most impoverished folks?
Yeah, well, and what was interesting when I was writing reporting and researching my profile of Rosa DeLauro is, I mean, she has been on the issue of expanding the child tax credit for decades. I think she was literally one of the first Congress people on it. She is described as dogged, will not give things up, and has just been pushing forward. But it really didn't. They did have some incremental successes here and there over the years, but nothing like what we've just seen. I think her efforts have been bolstered by a couple of things nationally. One is just, I think this whole conversation around UBI and the child tax credit and giving people money really has to stem back to Occupy Wall Street and the Great Recession and this huge awareness of income inequality and poverty that I just don't think was a conversation we were having previously. And movements pushing that, fight for 15, putting low wages on the map. And generates, I think, some room and some support for something like this, so that this policy idea that Rosa DeLauro and others have been pushing for years and years and trying to make tiny changes here and there, all of a sudden just sort of like bursts onto the scene. And you have, like you said, Biden talking about it. He goes down to Georgia and stumps on stimulus checks. This, like Alex was saying, this whole notion that Democrats now stand for giving people money is new, but I think that's where the roots traced from. And it's also not just Democrats, interestingly, at least on the child tax credit. You have Mitt Romney coming out with his own proposal, looks different than Democrats. I have lots of quibbles with it, but it's really interesting. I think there is some room for bipartisan movement here, potentially. The devil's in the details and that can get dicey, but I think the territory here has shifted a lot at the federal level.
And I mean, my sense is this stuff is pretty popular, right? I mean, Kalena, you were reporting from Washington for about 2 years. Now you're in Michigan, this key battleground state. It happens to be where I'm from too. And I know it's a major swing state. How do people think about stimulus or child credit, or even something that's a little more aspirational, like universal basic income? Are these policies popular when you go out and you're reporting and you're talking to people? I mean, is cash the answer for winning elections?
I don't know if it's the answer, but I know that it's popular. I mean, like 80% of Americans approve of stimulus checks. And when they typically don't approve of what's traditionally seen as welfare payments. And so when I was reporting, I was thinking a lot and talking with sources about, like maybe it's not that people hate welfare, it's just that they want it too. They feel like they deserve cash too. And so I think that's part of the reason why we've seen so much support for these policies. And another thing that I think I'd like to add in terms of like child poverty is that a number of the sources that I spoke with, mostly researchers, obviously I think this happened because we're in a pandemic, but I think part of it too is that we've seen so much recent emerging research on the effects of income poverty on child development. And so we know that income poverty affects children across their lifespan. It lasts for decades, the effects of not having enough. It translates into poor health outcomes, worse educational outcomes, just worse well-being, shorter lifespans, so much. And really a simple check can stem income poverty and can stem those outcomes. And so I think we see that translated into policy, and we see that now we see that adopted on the federal level, at least for a year.
Right. And I guess,
sorry.
No, go for it.
I was just going to jump in and piggyback on that to say that we've also seen emerging research that giving people cash works, that, poverty really hinders children's development. But on the flip side, if you give people money, it helps child development, it alleviates hunger. And also it doesn't seem to incentivize people to give up their jobs or, go do lots of drugs and drink lots of alcohol. Like it really, the evidence base is there. And I think that's a background to all this as well.
What do you say, Alex? Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I think both Bryce and Kalena are right on the money. I mean, it's right. The returns on this stuff, at least the research that we've seen, is like overwhelmingly positive. It's really hard to find a place to be cynical or negative about it. I mean, the outcomes are overwhelmingly one direction. The thing that I think I kind of piggyback on what Kalena was saying earlier, and Bryce, you kind of alluded to also, is that what's so good about it is the way that getting money out to people as fast as possible and getting rid of the hurdles is a real asset. That's why I think part of why it's so effective. It's also one of the drawbacks, I think, in some sense, in that, as Kalena mentioned, right, this is for a year. Well, in some ways, the fact that other programs like services that the government renders, the fact that they have administration is an asset in a way, because it's harder to get rid of them. So it's harder to set them up, but it's also harder to knock them down. And so, like in Ontario, for example, they had a UBI program that they were piloting. And at some point, the government there decided actually they were just going to cancel it. It was a 3-year program. 1 year in, they decided, well, we're not going to see this through. We're just going to stop it. And of course, all it is direct deposit. So it was very easy to shut that down. And so one day it was there, the next day it was gone. Whereas, something like Medicare is much more difficult to take apart block by block. And that's why even when you have Republican control of all 3 chambers of both chambers of Congress and the presidency, you don't really see them chipping away at it. And so there's kind of the double-edged sword here, where it's the speed and kind of the lack of administrative or bureaucratic structure is good, but it's also makes it easier for it to go away. And I think that's probably the concern going forward, is like, how do you make this permanent? Because it's very easy for it to go away. But I also would love to hear what you two think about that as kind of as we look forward past the 1 year mark of either the child tax credit or any of these programs.
Yeah, what do you think could be put in place? I don't know if you want to jump in, Kalena or Bryce, to make these more regular. And then another thought I had, which, I think this comes out of Kalena's story, that there's this kind of stigma associated with welfare in the American political narrative, with Congress people often, I think like you said, people are going to spend their welfare money on bad stuff. And a lot of the research just proves this. But is there kind of a new narrative that can come out of this stimulus moment that, this is actually good stuff? There shouldn't be a stigma associated with government helping people?
That was kind of the framing question of my article, and what I what I liked to ask every source. And I mean, it's a really big maybe, it's a big if, because first the child tax credit has to actually work, and then we probably need to make it permanent, and then maybe we can look ahead to see if it can change some of the ways that we think about welfare. But I think that it absolutely can, because having baked these ideas of like bootstrapping and individualism and racism and classism into our current welfare policy, that absolutely influences people's current views. It's like a vicious circle. And I think that we can have the same thing. It wouldn't be vicious. I think that we could have the same thing if we can get this program to actually work. And that actually kind of points to Alex's question about how to make it permanent, which was another thing that I thought a lot about and talked to. There are so many ideas on how to make it permanent. And I think I would really boil it down to the fact that we just need to make it successful, and we need to make it work. And then it will be hard to take it away, because there'll be millions of people who are expecting it, and millions of people who can point to how their children's lives are better. So how do we do that? We improve access. We make sure that people actually get it. I think that we should be working hard, maybe much harder, to get the word out so that people know that it actually exists, and that community groups, maybe the IRS could partner with them to connect people to the computers that they need to fill out the forms that they need to file taxes. Because for most people, it's going to be pretty easy to get the credit. It'll come automatically. But for the people who need it most, it won't, right? The people who need it most probably don't have to file income taxes. And maybe they don't think that they can file income taxes, or they don't know how. They've never done it before. And so the idea that we will just magically be giving this money to people, it's not going to happen. We have to make concerted efforts to make sure that people know that it's there and that they're eligible and they deserve it.
Well, and I would add to that too, that I think the politics aren't automatic either, right? I've been really interested watching Democrats talk right now about the mistakes made with the stimulus under Obama, and saying that they're mistakes, saying, we didn't talk about it. We didn't tell people what we did. And no one gave us credit. I think there have been lessons learned there about telling people, here's what we did. It belongs to you. Here's who to thank. If you want to see more of it, vote for us. It sounds crass, but really that's the best way that politics are supposed to work. We go to Washington, we get you something you need. You keep voting for us. We keep doing it. That's the best kind of system. And Democrats are often just way too timid about taking credit. So it'll be interesting if they can do that with stimulus checks, and if they can do that with the child tax credit, and effectively connect themselves to this policy, this money that's sort of flowing into people's accounts every month.
Yeah, just to add to that, just to show how far like the common sensibility has changed in that 12-year period. Like Barack Obama in 2009 was trying to figure out ways to obscure the fact that money was being given to people, because he didn't want it to be too political, right? And so they went to great lengths to obfuscate, despite the fact that they were giving people money. And then the result was that most Americans thought their taxes had actually gone up, despite the fact that it was the reverse was true. And so it's like, that's one of those things is how far we've come in a period of 12 years. It's like, it's hard sitting at this panel saying like, these are novel ideas. This is really different. Of course, like giving people money seems so obvious, but it's like literally the last Democratic administration, they were bending over backwards to figure out ways to ensure that people didn't think that they were getting money from the government. Like that was the worst possible outcome. And the Obama administration put all of its biggest and best brains to work figuring out ways to make sure nobody thought that. So like, that is actually a serious paradigm shift. And I think that's really worth underscoring that, that's a common sense thing that has really, really changed. Even if there are other things about Biden that are, maybe less different than Obama, that's certainly something of this political era specifically.
Well, what about, I think there's two myths I often see either among like the Silicon Valley set or among right-wing conservative economic commentators. One is that these stimulus checks are just going to people who don't need them. and it's wasted money. And then maybe the other is, which is like the Larry Summers critique, is that it's going to overheat the economy and there's too much money out there. I mean, does anyone want to take those and kind of unpack, why these kind of economic arguments don't really hold up to scrutiny?
I'll take an initial stab. So on the first question, did this money go to people who didn't need it? Did it have an impact? Was it just a waste? I will admit that you see a lot of differing studies saying different things about where people spent their stimulus money. I've seen a number of surveys showing that people mostly spent it on necessities, rent, food, groceries, gas, things like that, which would indicate that they needed money to be able to afford those things. We definitely know that the federal response to COVID, so that includes stimulus checks, it also includes enhanced SNAP, enhanced unemployment benefits, things like that, have kept poverty from rising. In fact, poverty fell in the first couple of months of the pandemic as people en masse lost their jobs. And every time that support has lapsed, poverty has risen again. And then when it's come back, it's fallen again. So I think you can make a really good case that the stimulus checks worked, or at least were part of this package that worked. As for overheating the economy, yes, Larry Summers is very worried about that. I think that the Biden administration is taking a very practical approach, and they're saying we're going to keep our eyes on long-term trends that could be concerning, but we've basically run the economy too cold for way too long. It was only just before the pandemic that we were starting to get back on a track of closer to full employment, where everyone who has a job wants one, which helps increase wages. That was only just starting to come into reality, and then we had a pandemic. So let's see ourselves out of this hole and then take a stock of where we've gotten.
And what's the view like, Kalena, from Michigan? I mean, what is the perception of the Biden administration?
I mean, it depends where you are in Michigan, right? Like, very different up north than it is where I am in southeastern Michigan. But I mean, again, and I've already spoken to this, but I mean, the stimulus checks have been so popular, and they're popular across parties. And so, I mean, I think that that's something that we really need to remember, as Bryce and Alex have already spoken to. And also to kind of piggyback on what Bryce was talking about with the stimulus checks, I think that another key point to kind of refute that right-wing myth that you mentioned is that obsessive targeting of benefits is what makes it so difficult for people to access them. If the expanded child tax credit, to kind of move to my favorite topic, was universal, it would be so much easier for people to get it. That's just expanding it to the 2% of the wealthiest kids who, yeah, maybe they don't need the child tax credit, but it would make it so much easier for the bottom 10% who maybe won't get it at all to receive it. And I wish that we could shift the thinking a little bit in that direction, right? Like, sure, maybe some people receive stimulus checks that, had savings, but then they use their checks to stimulate the economy. So the checks are still working.
Yeah,
Alex,
I think too that the people who have those concerns or who are most vocal about it being poorly targeted are also the same people who would never say, well, we can just raise taxes to claw it back retroactively or post facto. It's, obviously that's the solution. I mean, if you're concerned about poor targeting, we already have the tools to redress that. It's very simple. But of course, the idea of raising taxes on the rich is so revolting to that objection, or that solution rather, to the objection is never raised. So I don't even think it's that legitimate of an argument. I mean, if you're serious about benefits being poorly targeted, it's well, we know how to solve that. It's very easy. If you don't want rich people having too much money, and the idea that $4,000 or $1,000 a month or whatever is going to be, given our current state of inequality, that amount of money is a real backbreaker when it comes to, God forbid, the distribution of our resources are, extra $1,000 if someone doesn't need it. I mean, it doesn't seriously take stock of both the scope of the current situation or of the tools that we have to address those concerns. So I think a lot of the time what you're hearing is people who are not making sincere, good faith arguments. And I think obviously Larry Summers is probably someone for whom that sort of criticism is very well deserved. So, yeah, that's one that for me, I think is like, falls on deaf ears in some sense, because it's, it's an ideological argument. It's not really a policy one, and it's not really a sincere one either.
So one thing I always like to ask writers is kind of, what fell out of the article that, each of you wrote for this issue. Was there something that was left on the cutting room floor that you kind of wish, would have been included? And just something that was like, maybe sometimes for me, it's the seed of the next article. But were there any kind of details or color that you want to share with our members and our listeners here?
Okay,
no. All right, go for it, Kalena.
Not necessarily a seed of a next article, but just something fun, some color, like you said. I interviewed Luke Schaefer, professor at Michigan, actually a former professor of mine, and author $2 a Day. And we talked about what it felt like for him when the child tax credit was passed. And it was very nice and heartwarming to hear. He talked about how he had a dance party for about a week, and he downloaded dance party music. And let's see, what else did he say? He said that he wrote a thank you note to Sherrod Brown, because I think he was kind of close to Sherrod Brown. And though I guess he also said he wasn't sure if Sherrod ever got the note, but yeah, so I guess I would say that I heard people's like personal like joy, I guess, from the tax credit passing, people who had worked on it. And so that was really nice. Like a little cheesy, right? But it's not a problem to feel cheesy about something that really is going to change millions of people's lives.
Do either of you guys want to weigh in, or you don't want to share your secrets of what kind of fell out of your stories, showing a little too much interiority? Okay, is there anything we missed that we want to share with our dedicated fandom of the American Prospect? Something from your articles that you think is really crucial to understanding cash assistance, or kind of how government can better help people? Because otherwise we might have covered all the bases here, and we might just say that, if you like what we're doing, it's all available for free at prospect.org. And when the stimulus checks did ship, we thought it was maybe a little distasteful to put out a call to subscribe or donate your stimulus check to the Prospect. But we're very thankful for all of our members and subscribers and those of us who are reading closely. And we love to hear your feedback. Send us a note or a tweet. Send our articles to your friends. And thanks for listening. And thank you to Kalena, Bryce, and Alex for your contributions to our new issue.